Welcome to Design Talk Stockholm at Stockholm University. I'm sitting here with two distinguished guest professors from University of Wisconsin-Madison, Erika Helmerson and Richard Hansen. Could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah. So my field is the learning sciences, which is the study of what it means both to know and to learn from a cognitive perspective as well as a sociocultural perspective. And most importantly to this conversation, how to leverage those insights in the design of learning environments. And my area of expertise is the arts. So I look at how people learn both in the arts as well as through the arts across a range of disciplines, including the performing arts, the visual arts, as well as the digital media arts with an emphasis on the maker movement and maker spaces.
Thank you. And Rich?
Hi, Stefan. I study how technologies change organizations. And I'm particularly interested in how they change organizations in educational environments. So I study how digital media and data change school-level organizations from the district to the state level. But I also study how to build learning environments using digital media for students and for learning in schools.
And I'm so happy to have both of you here because it's an opportunity to discuss design questions in relation to learning and change at different levels. I think I will start with you, Rich. Could you say a few things about your thinking about organizational development from a design perspective?
Yes, I think a lot about, even though I talk about technology, I always think that if you think about how technology changes organizations, it's always a question of people. And the tools are really exist to help change the practices of people and to facilitate the practices of people. So when we think about technology and organizational change, it's often about which tools allow people to do different kinds of practices. And I think a lot about the role of leadership in that area, because leaders are the people who design the environments for people to change practices. So if you think about leadership in schools, leaders establish the conditions for people in schools to do different things, to change the practices of teaching and learning. And then typically you need new kinds of tools, new kinds of technologies to make that happen.
And you have been developing something in that direction, haven't you?
Yes, I've been in my past career. I've studied other organizations, and recently I've gotten into the work of trying to spark change in organizations through a research group that I've developed at the University of Wisconsin. We developed a site called the Network Ed site, which is designed to map innovators.
Could you share it for us?
Sure, yes, I think we'll put it up here. It's designed to provide a map of all the people we're working in Wisconsin who are interested in being innovators in education, whether they're educators or policymakers or funders or community members. Anybody who's really interested in trying to make a change in public schooling in the state, we're trying to make a map so they can connect with one another and come up with new ideas together to change the schools.
Before you show us more about how you can use that, I think it's, for me, a bit of a change in perspective, because most strategies at that level, political level, is about giving information, giving results of research to teachers to make knowledge overviews. But you take the other angle to it, saying connect people and they will find information to develop.
I think this comes from a long course of research that talks about organizations as groups of people. And it's people who make change. And so when we think about social capital or social network theory, it's the connections between people and resources that mobilize change. And so rather than focus on an idea to make change, our concept is to connect the people who are interested in change and then support the ideas that they come up with.
And how do you do that?
Well, the site is based around, it's a Google Maps interface. It's an open source tool that anybody can use and adapt. And the idea is we have people nominate folks who are innovators in local practices and put them on the map. And so you can locate who in your community is doing interesting work in education. So for example, if you look, we have in the Milwaukee area in Wisconsin, we have a number of people who are interested in doing using technologies for change. And so if you live in the Milwaukee area and you want to look at a charter school or another organization that's interested in making change, you can use this as sort of a geographical based directory of other innovative people in your area.
How do I get information about what they're doing? Not only where they are.
You can click on any of the projects that we have. So if we take the Milwaukee Public Schools site, for example, you get Milwaukee Environmental Sciences is an innovation that's happening in the city of Milwaukee around education around the environment. There's contact information, there's related content, and this is a kind of a resource that people can use to both, if you are in the community, to find the resources that are available to you, but if you're interested in partnering with other folks who are innovators, these folks were identified as people who are pushing the boundary for what's possible in education. So we wanted to create a directory of people who are interested in making change, with the idea that if you mobilize people and then give them resources and ideas, that's where change can happen in education. One of our commitments in this site is that it is an open source site and it is a crowdsourced site. So anybody, any organization in the world could take the code and develop one of these locally for themselves. And the crowdsourcing aspect of it means that it's not authored by a single site, but the members of a community are the people who populate the site and make it live.
So we take this idea of design at that scale and give it to Erica. I mean, you're working more with people-to-people communication, on a micro level, we could say. What is your idea about designs for learning in relation to improvisation and what you talked about, developing art knowledge, but also developing that kind of knowledge in other areas?
And so I mentioned in my introduction that I'm interested both in how we understand what people learn in arts-based environments, but also how people learn through arts-based methods in other domains. And so what I wanted to talk about today was this second piece, which is how we can learn from one of my arts-based training, improvisational comedy, what we can learn about the design of learning environments from the way we engage improvisationally with one another in kind of this theatrical metaphor. And I want to mention 4 big ideas that I think emerge from that perspective. The first is the cardinal rule of improv, they call it, which is always say yes. And what that means is to always accept what your partner is offering you and use that as the foundation for the next set of interactions that you have. And so in teaching and learning, what that means is to never be dismissive of a contribution. It doesn't mean that you always have to agree and say you're right, but rather to say, what does it mean that person is trying to communicate, trying to express, and how can I use that as we move toward a shared goal that we might have? So this idea of always saying yes, and the corollary to that is to always say yes and. So to use that as the launching point for the next set of interactions. The next rule of improv is to avoid answering with a question. So to avoid saying, well, what do you mean by that? Or can you say more? But rather to make a statement that you believe is connected to the prior person's statement so that together you're constructing a narrative of meaning. And then the final principle is actually my favorite, which is that there are no mistakes, only opportunities. And what's meant by that in improv is that you might set up a scene and your partner may interpret a gesture in a way that you hadn't intended. And rather than saying, oh, no, I didn't mean that, I meant something else, you bring that interpretation into the conversation. And the way I interpret that in terms of the teaching and learning design endeavor is this notion of reclaiming failure. So rather than saying failure is a lack of learning, and if we see failure, we have to start over or we have to do something different, we say, oh, failure is a part of learning. And what can we learn from this perceived failure in terms of what was accomplished, in terms of how what was accomplished is and is not related to the outcome that we had intended, and how that can be part of this iterative cycle that Rich mentioned of seeing how a tool or a process that you put into the world actually helps people to do their work better.
I think it's a great principle, but I also imagine that when you described your mapping site, those principles are actually there. It seems to be a difficult affair to introduce design principles not only to support more efficiency, but also to reflect over what do we call knowledge, do we accept as knowledge and learning in this environment, and how can we develop that. So that's my challenge to you. What would you say?
I think that a key decision for all design questions is what counts as a constraint and what counts as an affordance. And conventional design in conventional contexts doesn't question the constraints. So the school context is a really good example where we say, okay, we have a fixed goal that we need to improve test scores, or we need to improve graduation, and that's the constraint that becomes the goal of the design environment. But I think innovative leaders, and I think of innovative leaders as designers, question those constraints. They question the limits of them, but they also question the degree to which those constraints provide affordances for further design. So there's many school designers will say that if we aim at graduation, we have to establish a sequence of classes that's necessary to move towards graduation. And other designers to say, no, we need to throw out the sequence of classes and we need to start thinking about motivating experiences that help kids want to proceed towards graduation. And so thinking about that as a design space where some of the constraints get refigured as affordances is a key aspect of design. And I think that's the sort of innovative thinking that we need in our schools to open up new possibilities in that space.
What would you say?
I think, so this was not what I was originally going to say, but as Rich was talking, this made me think of it. I think on the micro level, the version of that is assessment, which is that we're often, the fixed constraint in the design of learning environments is the assessment. So we're going to measure learning in this way. And you can do whatever you want, in the process, but you have to get to this assessment metric. And so I think a lot, and I think folks who take this design perspective think a lot about the relationship between the assessment process and the learning process, where they're integrated much more seamlessly. So I do a lot of work with product-based learning environments where the goal is to build something, to make something. And so the assessment is integrated into the making of the thing.
Well, I have one comment about that. I've mentioned earlier about thinking about design as the design of organizations, but I think the most pressing 21st century learning need is to enable students to take ownership of the design of their own learning environments. We all, as professionals in the 21st century, construct our own learning environments out of websites and online resources and colleagues and social networks. And yet our schools, the students who are successful in schools construct those learning environments for themselves, but we don't teach that in our schools. We still teach according to a model where the school provides the learning environment and the students participate in the learning environment. And I think when we take this design perspective, if we see that a key outcome for our young people is to give them the design skills and the ownership and sort of the power to say that they need to develop these skills in order to advance their own learning goals, I think it's really an important transition for us to make.
One more theoretical idea that I think has a lot of purchase in this conversation, which is the notion of the distributed nature of knowledge. You know, that we as learning scientists have accepted, I think, generally that knowing is a distributed act between people and tools and time, and there are many famous studies in our field, Ed Hutchins and others, who've demonstrated this distributed nature of knowledge. Where we're less inclined, but where I think we want to go, and I think this conversation wants to go, is to the more distributed nature of teaching and instruction. So rather than, you know, I mentioned earlier, we have these two guiding metaphors for teaching, right? We have the sage on the stage, which we say, oh, no, we want more of this guide on the side. But even the guide on the side implies that there is a person who has some set of knowledge that they can share with less experienced others, that those less experienced others can absorb or use to produce their evidence of their own then understanding of what this guide already knows. And for me, a distributed notion of instruction has the teaching distributed between people and tools and time, as well as the knowledge.
So then comes the question, how can we introduce a more vivid discussion about learning in a context where knowledge standards are so powerful?
Well, I think that I think they're both learning. They're both very old models of learning. Schools have evolved in our society because there's whole bodies of knowledge that don't come naturally. Like algebra doesn't come naturally to anybody. Neither does chemistry. These are massive amounts of facts and algorithmic information that have to be memorized in order to be understood, and our civilization depends upon people knowing those complex fields. And so schools have evolved to convey and give access to these complex webs of knowledge and experience that get sort of coalesced into disciplines. However, the other form of learning and knowing that we have is much more of an apprentice-based experiential model that depends upon learning a discourse. It's very informal. And I think school for a long time was dominated by that first kind of knowledge, the discipline-based knowledge. But new technologies have given a new life to more apprentice-based informal knowledge, and it is a parallel world now where young people participate in both of the worlds. And I think what we're starting to see is that young people and experienced workers who can navigate both of those worlds and bring them together can amplify their disciplinary knowledge by connection with valuable social online resources. And I think this is the learning environment of the future, and I think I'm very excited about it. And so I think it will be a combination of, rather than a replacement of, the traditional model.
And that's where your principles comes in, also to connect these two worlds. Because there's someone who knows all these things in an established knowledge area. And all those people being interested in learning in from different angles. And that is a starting point of a dialogue about what is this field about, and what can we bring into the field, and how can we use knowledge in the field to solve problems. Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan.